Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Coffee. Without it, we would never have had the Industrial Revolution. We'd all be still living in Europe in mud huts. Here in Laredo, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson, the best coffee on the planet. If you can't get to Laredo, you can order from the Organic Man Coffee Trike.shop. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Christmas is coming up faster than the speed of government. You can find all kinds of cool things at teepublic.com. That's T-E-E. Just look for Strange Things with Chris James or anything you'd rather look at. They have a lot of neat stuff. You can get a coffee cup for that weird uncle you don't know what he'd like. For my family, I already have the coffee cup. And not just t-shirts, but all manner of things for the folks who enjoy showing off their tastes or the ones you don't know what to get them. Just to make it a bit more attractive, everything is on sale right now. That's at teepublic.com. I know I've done several shows about people who are missing under bizarre circumstances. I think this is number 6, but I'm not quite sure if that's the right number or not. If you go searching and you only find 4 or 5, it could be because I used a few other names like Into Thin Air or something like that. People go missing all the time. Most turn back up, sometimes saying they just wanted to get away from their problems or their lives. Most people don't realize they take their problems with them. My dad used to always say, if all the problems were hung on a tree, everybody would pick their own. Others never return, leaving behind friends and family whose lives will never be the same. 1930, Anjikuni Lake along the Kazan River in Kivlik region of Nunavut, Canada. Good Lord, those French and Inuit words. It was filled with fish, making it a good spot for a village. The folks living there hunted and fished, raising families, burying their dead for generations. Trappers would pass through, knowing they would be welcome, and they would find hot food and a place to sleep away from the predators that might try to make them into a meal. Legends were spoken of giving people something to think about while out in the woods alone at night. Things like the Wendigo, nasty wood spirits, other strange creatures that added to the already hazards out in the woods. Nobody wanted to spend the night in the wilderness just in case these stories might be true. A Canadian fur trapper named Joe LaBelle was in the area, and as the sun was going down, he decided to head for the village. Joe had been there before. The villagers all knew him, and he knew most of them. As he entered the village, the lack of sound was the first thing he noticed. There should be all kinds of sounds people make while working around the camp. There should have been kids playing, even dogs barking. People sounds. Joe walked along the paths between the cabins, looking for any of the locals. He even tried yelling out to let the villagers know he was there. He was met by only silence. Having lived in the wild for decades, Joe had the feeling something was wrong. Very wrong. He began checking the tents and the cabins, looking for anyone who could tell him what was going on. The sun was on the horizon, and it was getting dark. There were no people, and it looked as if they had been gone for a little while. All the campfires were cold. The cook stoves were dead. He looked around in the gathering gloom, and he did spot smoke coming from a cabin. Practically running, Joe went to the cabin and pounded on the side. There was no response, so he pulled the door covering open. Meat was smoldering over the remains of a fire. It had become charcoal some time ago. People living in the middle of nowhere know you don't leave cooking unattended. A fire could destroy the only place you have to get in out of the cold. It will also take away all of your possessions, leaving you with nothing but the clothes you're wearing. Joe kept searching for someone to tell him what had happened in the village that could cause everyone to leave in what looked like a huge hurry. In all the cabins and tents, he found food was still there, ready to be used. There were all the personal items the villagers would never leave behind. Things like rifles and knives, packs for carrying things, extra clothing. When winter got really nasty, all those things would be much needed. All along the shore of the lake sat kayaks that were used for fishing. The people were gone, but their things were still there. Thinking about some of the legends, Joe scanned the village looking for any signs of something maybe having attacked it. The cabins and tents looked okay, a bit worn and in need of repair, but there was nothing to tell him what had happened to the villagers. Being a trapper and knowing how to track animals, Joe went to the edge of the village looking for any sign of which direction they may have gone. Even if the villagers had left a week ago, there should be some evidence of several dozen people all walking in the same direction. The snow wasn't disturbed in any direction. Joe LaBelle was tired, and it was dark. He had no intention of spending any more time in the abandoned village. The stories of evil spirits became more real as the village went from dark to nearly black. He grabbed his pack and headed for the telegraph office, located several miles away. He had to walk through the woods in the dark, with temperatures dropping as he went. He finally managed to find the office, and once inside, he sent a message to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. A friend of mine used to be in the UCMP. He retired last year. John was always good for some interesting stories coming out of British Columbia. Things like Bigfoot or sea monsters. One day, while in Jefferson, I saw him standing in the parking lot in a t-shirt and shorts. I had on a wool hat, my fleece, a jacket, scarf, and gloves. John said the weather was nice. I said it was freezing. Joe LaBelle sent the telegram to the RCMP barracks telling them about the bizarre happenings at the village. The Mounties put together a detail and rode out to investigate. They stopped at Armand Laurent's cabin, which also served as a trading post. They told Armand they were there to investigate the possible incident at the Anjukuni village. Armand said he had seen strange lights in the sky several days ago. The lights had turned into a flying thing with lights all along its edges. It looked like a cross between a bullet and a cylinder. This flying craft was heading in the direction of the village. The Mounties either arrived the morning after Joe LaBelle had sent the telegram or the following day. Some reports differ. The Mounties began their investigation. This was in 1930. There were none of the fancy forensics back then. Mostly they had their eyes and experience to go on. They searched the cabins and the tents, looking for anything that might tell the story. In the graveyard, the Mounties discovered the graves had been opened. The bodies had been dug up and taken away. This was unheard of amongst the natives. Violating a grave was considered taboo. The winter had been cold and the ground was frozen. How did anyone manage to dig into the frozen ground to remove the bodies? Why would anyone do such a thing? All over the village, the bodies of several dogs were found, having been left behind as the villagers fled. Dogs were not just pets. These were the creatures used to pull the sleds used by the villagers. The people had left in such a hurry they had abandoned their animals as well. There was a lot of food left in the cabins and tents, yet the dogs looked as if they had starved to death. The dogs could have easily entered any of the buildings since, instead of doors, the villagers hung caribou hide over the openings. The timeline didn't add up either. Joe LaBelle had arrived and found a few fires still burning in the village. A fire would not have burned for days, maybe hours, but not days. The Mounties arrived maybe 2 days after the villagers had vanished. A dog, let alone a bunch of dogs, would not starve to death in just a few days. The only possible explanation was the villagers had sat there as their dogs died from a lack of food before everybody walked away, leaving behind everything. The investigation lasted into the late evening. As the sun was going down, the Mounties saw a bluish light on the horizon. No one thought they were seeing the aurora borealis. These men knew about the northern lights. They were all familiar with them. The lights they were seeing looked like something otherworldly. There's no telling what the men doing the investigation thought was going on. They all saw things that made no sense. The evidence pointed to unexplainable things happening less than a week ago. The official report said the villagers had all walked away from their homes 2 months before Joe LaBelle arrived in the village. The report didn't explain how the few fires that Joe saw could have burned for 2 months unattended. The reports didn't even mention any fires. When the newspapers got a hold of the story, the editors wanted photographs of the village. There were no images available, so the newsmen simply used images of Indian villages from other parts of the country. As years went by, those who refused to believe in anything paranormal all said the whole thing was a hoax, since the photographs were from someplace other than Anjukuni village. If you visit the RCMP webpage today, you will find a disclaimer about the 1930 mystery. Their official website says, March 24th, 2017, the disappearance in the 1930s of an Inuit village near Lake Anjikuni is not true. An American author by the name of Frank Edwards is reported to have started this story in his book Stranger Than Science. It has become a popular piece of journalism, repeatedly published and referred to in books and magazines. There is no evidence, however, to support such a story. I would expect nothing less in an official report. Governments don't like unexplained things. If there was anything bizarre going on, people might think the RCMP or the government in the area don't care or didn't do a good enough job investigating the mass disappearance. I would put this whole official report right up there with the weather balloon story coming from Roswell. Could an entire village simply vanish into the unknown? There have been a lot of unexplainable things happen, especially in the middle of nowhere. October 1945. A life insurance salesman told George Sodder that his house would go up in smoke and his children would be killed if he didn't take out an insurance policy. George thought the salesman was angry as he couldn't make a sale, but with the events that followed, it seems this would turn out to be a bizarre and questionable prediction. The following week, an electrician visited and warned that the faulty fuse box could cause a severe fire. George called the electric company, who had just rewired the property, and they had installed a new gas stove. He complained. The company reassured George that the house was perfectly safe, and the electrician, who mentioned the fault, was likely looking to charge for extra work. The matter was brushed off. Christmas Eve, 1945. A fire ripped through the Sodder home in the middle of the night. The house was completely destroyed and only 4 of the 9 Sodder children managed to escape. 5 of the kids vanished during the night, and there's no evidence they died in the fire or that they were even in the house that night. Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jenny, 8, and Betty, 5, were never seen again. Their parents, George and Jenny, alongside their surviving siblings, Joe, who was 21 and away in the military, Marion, 17, George Jr., 16, and Sylvia, who was 2, were plagued for the rest of their lives with the mystery of what really happened that night. Did the children die in the fire? Were they murdered or maybe kidnapped? More than 75 years later, there are still many facts about this disappearance that just don't add up. The Sodder family home was located in a small Appalachian town 2 miles north of Fayetteville, West Virginia. The wood frame 7-bedroom house had been purchased by businessman George Sodder for his wife Jenny and their 9 children. On Christmas Eve, 5 of the Sodder children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, had asked if they could stay up late. The mother agreed and made the children promise they would lock the door before coming upstairs to bed. At 12:30 a.m., Jenny was awoken by the phone ringing. She had to get out of bed, walk downstairs to the kitchen, where the phone was mounted on the wall. There were no such things as cell phones back then. Back then, few homes even had phones, let alone a phone in more than one room. When she answered, an unfamiliar female voice asked for a name she didn't know. Jenny heard loud laughter in the background, and before she could tell the caller, "You have the wrong number," and then hung up. As Jenny made her way back to bed, she noticed the door was unlocked. She assumed the kids had forgotten before going to bed. She locked the door and went back upstairs. As she was about to fall asleep, she heard a loud bang, followed by something rolling across the roof. She didn't think anything of it. Living in the country, maybe it was just something falling from a tree. It was late, and she just wanted to get back to sleep. Not long after Jenny had fallen to sleep, the house was filled with smoke. In a panic, George and Jenny fled from the house while shouting for the other children to run for safety. Once outside, the parents saw the house was fully in flames. They were frantically trying to save the 5 children who were still inside, as far as they knew. The rooms where the children slept were on the top floor. George ran to get the ladder, hoping to set it up at the window to one of the bedrooms. When George ran to the garage for the ladder, he couldn't find it. He had used the ladder just the other day, and he knew right where it should be. It was gone. Later on, an investigation found the ladder had been thrown in a ditch behind the house. Unable to find his ladder, George decided to start one of the trucks and drive it to the side of the house and use this to climb up to the window. He tried both trucks. Neither would start. He had used both trucks just the other day. Now they were both dead. George was badly cut from smashing windows in an attempt to save his children, although there was now no hope for their survival. George and Jenny had tried to call the fire department, but the phone lines were not working. They had to run to a neighbor's house for help, but within 45 minutes the entire Sodder family home had collapsed. The neighbor had to drive into town and look for the fire chief. Although the fire department was only 2.5 miles from the Sodder home, the fire trucks didn't respond to the emergency until 8 in the morning, 7 hours after the fire had begun. By then, all that remained of the house was ashes and debris. Following a brief search among the rubble, the Sodder family had expected to find skeletons, but they only found a small handful of bone fragments. The fire department then postponed the investigation because it was Christmas Day. George and Jenny were desperately searching for the children's remains the rest of the day. When a maintenance worker arrived at the house, it was discovered that the phone lines had been cut rather than burned by the fire. Following an inquest from the fire department, it was reported that the fire had started in one of the basement rooms as a result of faulty wiring from a Christmas light. Christmas lights in the basement? Strangely, the insurance salesman who had threatened George was also one of the jurors during the inquest. The children's deaths were then declared accidental. Jenny was devastated by the loss of her children, as she decided to investigate their disappearance independently. She visited a local crematorium to find out if the fire could have destroyed human bone. In order to cremate an entire body, you need a sustained fire burning above 850 degrees for a minimum of 2 hours. The Sodder home burned for about 45 minutes before collapsing in on itself. Yes, there would still be embers burning under the debris, and a house fire can get really hot, but experts have all said that the house fire was not sufficient to cremate 5 bodies. Even had the fire been hot enough, bones don't burn. They char and eventually fall apart, but there should have been plenty of bones left in the burned out house. The more Jenny looked into the unexplained fire, the more she began to suspect her children had been kidnapped and the fire was started to hide the evidence. Who was the mystery woman who had called the house just minutes before the fire? How about that loud bang on the roof? This, combined with the cut phone lines, missing ladder, 2 trucks not starting, all began to look like someone or several people had conspired to take their children. 30 years later, Jenny was interviewed by the Raleigh Register. She said, "You can't tell me that 5 children could burn up in a little old house like that and something wouldn't be left. No, I'll never believe it. If the children hadn't all died in the fire, then what had happened to them? Could someone have kidnapped 5 kids in the middle of the night without anyone making enough noise to wake the parents who were sleeping just upstairs? 5 people were in the same house when the 5 kids vanished. One of the people in the house was only 2, but the others should have heard something." These questions led to Jenny and George wondering, why was there never any ransom note? Where were the kids that went missing? They paid for a giant billboard that read, "What was the fate of our children? Kidnapped, murdered, or burned?" They offered a $5,000 reward for information. That would be $217,000 in today's money. The police received many reports following the disappearance of the children. One of the witnesses claimed that she had served them breakfast the morning after the fire. The woman said she was working at a hotel in Charleston, 50 miles west from the Sodder home. She said that the children were accompanied by 2 women and 2 men. All looked as if they were Italians. They registered at around midnight. As she said, she tried to talk to the children, just in a friendly manner, but the men appeared hostile, and they refused to allow her to talk to these kids. One of the men looked at her in a hostile manner. He turned around and began talking rapidly in Italian. Immediately, the whole party stopped talking to her. As she sensed she was being frozen out, and so she said nothing more. They left early the next morning. The sighting either did not prove useful for the investigation, or they were unable to locate the group the witness had described. There are many online sleuths who believe George's political beliefs fueled the fateful events that happened in Christmas Eve 1945. Born 1895 in Sardinia, he was named Giorgio Sodù before immigrating to America at the age of 13. George eventually worked his way up to the top in business, and he owned his own coal trucking company. He met Jenny Capriani, who was also an Italian immigrant. The Sodder family was well respected and middle class, but George had strong anti-Mussolini views and was against the fascist government in Italy. By December 1945, Mussolini had been dead for 8 months. His minions had been scattered to the four corners of the planet. No one living in the United States would have wanted to voice their support of El Duce. In Fayetteville, many of the families were also Italian immigrants who kind of disagreed with George's views. Also, the coal trucking business was under constant pressure from the Sicilian mafia, and George knew this. A few weeks before the fire, the Sodder children had complained that a strange car was following them when they returned home from school. Many believed the disappearance of the children was connected to the mafia somehow. The mafia were instrumental in helping the U.S. Army invade Sicily, and this gave them far more power than they should have ever had. Louis Sodder was 9 years old when he was last seen alive. 22 years later, after his disappearance, his mother Jenny received a letter from Central City, Kentucky. It had no return address. The letter also came with a picture that was believed to have been Louis. A message on the back of the photo read, "Louis Sodder, I love Brother Frankie." This was odd since none of the family was named Frankie. George and Jenny hired a private detective to look into the photo and try to locate the sender. Unfortunately, the detective was never able to find anything. George told the Charleston Gazette-Mail it was like hitting a rock wall. You can't go any further. Despite never being able to confirm if the photo really was Louis, the parents had it framed and placed above the fireplace. The disappearance of the Sodder children has remained an unsolved mystery for decades. Despite this becoming such a high-profile case, the FBI never got involved. In 1947, George and Jenny made an appeal directly to J. Edgar Hoover, hoping he would help. They received a personal letter from Hoover who said that although he would like to be of service, the matter appeared to be a local problem and that it didn't come under the jurisdiction of the Bureau. Other FBI agents said they were willing to help the family once they were granted permission by the local authorities, but for some reason, both the Fayetteville Police and Fire Department refused to give the go-ahead. It was another devastating blow for the Sodder family. The home that perished in the fire was never rebuilt. Instead, they turned the plot into a memorial garden and tended the flowers in honor of the 5 missing kids. George died in 1969, and Jenny died in 1989. The only surviving member of the family was Sylvia, the youngest of the Sodder children, who was 2 years old the night of the fire. Talk about a bizarre case. Threats of fire from 2 different sources weeks before the fire broke out. The phone lines were cut. The ladder was missing. Both trucks refused to start. This all sounds too much of a coincidence to be unrelated. Why did the fire department take so long to respond? When I was a firefighter, we rolled on many Christmas Day fires. Holidays were never an excuse to not respond. I could understand one body maybe being totally consumed by the fire, but not 5. There should have been something left. How about the FBI not being asked to look into the case by the local authorities? Could the 5 kids still be alive today? Betty was 5 years old when she vanished. as she would be 81 today. 5 people could not go through life without leaving behind some clue as to who they were and where they were from. Yet, we have nothing to tell us what happened to the kids who disappeared in 1945. May 1967. Late one afternoon, 3 boys living in Missouri went out for some adventure. They just happened to live in Hannibal, Missouri, home of Samuel Clemens, better known as Mark Twain. Twain had written a few stories about people exploring caves, and Hannibal had many. A lot of folks don't know it, but Huckleberry Finn was not a children's story. If you ever read the books, you'll soon realize these stories were adult. The boys in Hannibal were out to relive some of these stories. Billy Hogue, 10, Joey Hogue, 13, and Craig Dowell, 14, walked to one of the caves, and as far as anyone knows, they got lost deep inside the earth. The boys were last seen on their way to Murphy's Cave. This led searchers to head that way and look. The search party went into Murphy's Cave, and they tried their best. When kids get lost, they usually tend to sit down and wait for rescue. Usually. Having 3 boys, the oldest being 14, they just might have tried to find their way out, only to get farther into the cave. The one and only witness said it looked like the 3 boys were heading to the cave. The 3 were also fond of cave exploration. This led to folks assuming the boys were lost in the cave. There had been a highway project underway in the area, and as the workers were blasting the rock, they would open up cave tunnels running back into the mountains. The boys had come home on many occasions covered in red clay from one or another cave. As soon as the boys were reported missing, cavers and rescue teams showed up in Hannibal and prepared for a search. They entered every cave opening and looked for the 3. As time went on, they moved farther into the caves, still hoping to find them. The floors of most of these caves were covered in dirt. Anyone walking or crawling would leave behind footprints or drag marks. Eventually, hope turned to fear. The searchers were now looking for bodies instead of the living. When nothing was found, the search was eventually abandoned. Recently, an effort was made to map the caves in Hannibal. A team doing the work used modern technology to create a 3D representation of what is to be found under the ground in Hannibal. They found no evidence of the 3 boys ever being lost in the back parts of the cave. This has led to many folks speculating the 3 never made it to Murphy's Cave. Children do run away from home. Usually it's just one kid that wants to get away from his life. Kids aren't very creative when it comes to leaving home. They wound up being found a short time later. Some are never found. What makes the folks living in Hannibal, Missouri so distressed is just not knowing. After over 50 years, there should have been someone found. 3 boys wandering around the countryside eventually should have decided they were hungry or tired and they just wanted to go home. No bodies found in the cave, and no one ever seeing the 3 again. This would make most folks think something else must have happened. Someone or several people might have kidnapped these boys, and they've never been found. Mikell Biggs was last seen riding her bicycle near her family's residence in Mesa, Arizona, January 2nd, 1999. Her and her young sister thought they heard the ice cream truck's music in the distance, and they asked their mother for some money to buy treats. Mikkel and her sister waited for the truck near Toltec Street and El Moro Avenue at around 5:50 p.m. As they were waiting, her sister said she was cold, and so she ran into the house to grab her coat. Then, as she returned to where her sister should have been waiting. But when she got back, Mikkel was gone. Her bicycle and the 2 quarters her mother had given her were found near the street where she'd been standing. The tires on the bicycle were still spinning. It was laying on its side. Mikkel and her sister had only been separated for about 90 seconds. Authorities searched the entire area near Mikkel's family home, but no evidence pertaining to her whereabouts was found. Search dogs lost her scent after only a few feet, suggesting she had been placed into a vehicle and driven away. Authorities were unable to confirm if there had even been an ice cream truck in the area at the time of her disappearance. All of the local vendors in the area were cleared of involvement in the case. Known sex offenders in the vicinity were also cleared of any connection to the missing girl. There have been many false leads in Mikkel's case. January 9th, the police dug up what appeared to be a freshly dug grave outside of Mesa. They found nothing. 2 witnesses were put under hypnosis in hopes that they would remember something, but nothing came of that. A copper-colored Jeep was reportedly spotted near Mikkel's home at the time that she was last seen, but the driver was located and he was ruled out as a suspect. He also said that he hadn't seen anything unusual. Houses in the neighborhood were searched with the consent of their owners, but to no avail. Only one homeowner refused to permit a search. He was not considered a suspect. He was just thought of being just a bit paranoid. On March 10th, 1999, a man reportedly tried to abduct 2 girls, a 10-year-old and an 11-year-old, from the schoolyard. Police thought the incident might have been connected to Mikkel's case, but the abduction was proven to be a hoax. Investigators had a sketch of 2 possible suspects in the disappearance. The sketches were not widely publicized since they weren't even sure if these were the right people to look for. Mikkel was described as an intelligent, artistic, sociable person. She was an honor student. She wanted to become an animator when she grew up. Mikkel's father became convinced he knew who was responsible for his daughter's abduction. A man named D. Blaylock lived 2 blocks from the Biggs' home in the 90s. He had prior convictions for sex offenses in 3 different states. He was a registered sex offender. In 2001, he was convicted of attacking a neighbor and trying to kill her. He was sentenced to 15.5 years in an Arizona prison. When Mikkel was first reported missing, Blaylock's wife said her husband was at home the entire time working in their garage. After he was convicted in the unrelated case, Mikkel's parents went to visit him and asked if he'd had anything to do with the disappearance of their daughter. Blaylock claimed he had nothing to do with the young girl's abduction. Mikkel's family eventually moved to Gilbert, Arizona. On the 5th anniversary of her disappearance, the family held a funeral for her with an empty casket. They believe Mikkel was murdered shortly after her disappearance. No charges have been filed against anyone in the case. There are a few leads in Mikkel's disappearance, and her case remains unsolved. Brandon Lawson was 26-year-old oil field worker from San Angelo, Texas. He lived with his common-law wife of 10 years, Ladisha Lofton. Brandon had 4 children, 3 of them with Letitia and 1 from a prior relationship. He worked long hours to provide for his family, and by all accounts would not have voluntarily gone missing. Ladisha claimed at one point that Brandon was working up to 95 hours a week. Brandon was 5'9", weighed approximately 230 pounds. He had several tattoos and a few scars, making him easy to identify. At the time he went missing, Brandon was wearing a yellow shirt, green camouflage shorts, and a pair of tennis shoes. On the night of the disappearance, Brandon and Letitia got into an argument. Brandon left their home in San Angelo, Texas, with intentions of driving to his father's home in Crowley, 3.5 hours away. Shortly after he left, Ladisha called Brandon to ask him to not go all the way to Crowley for the night. Instead, she suggested he drive around to cool off for a bit. Maybe he could head over to his brother Kyle's house and spend the night there. Kyle's home was only 5 minutes away. It is possible this conversation persuaded Brandon as he began driving north on Highway 277 towards Abilene, rather than east on Highway 67, which have put him in the direction of his father's home in Crowley. It is also possible Brandon was taking a slightly longer back road route to Crowley for some unspecified reason. He knew his truck was nearly out of gas, but he was still attempting to make it to the 24-hour Stripes convenience store in Brant, about 30 minutes from his home. Brandon's truck was found on the side of Highway 277, 4.5 miles outside of Brant and a quarter mile from the rest area. As Brandon was out driving, Ladisha called his brother, concerned about him and the argument that they'd had. Kyle offered to come over to check on Ladisha and the children, one of whom had been sick for the past several days. Kyle arrived at Brandon and Ladisha's home at about 12:10 in the morning. Approximately 45 minutes after leaving home, Brandon called Kyle and told him that his truck was out of gas on the side of 277 near Bronte, Texas. Kyle had some difficulty understanding everything Brandon was saying because the call was repeatedly dropped due to spotty signal. He was able to make out Brandon saying, "I'm 10 minutes up the road. Just hurry up and get here." Kyle then called Ladisha to inform her that Brandon was out of gas. Kyle suggested that he and his girlfriend Audrey stop by Brandon and Ladisha's house and pick up a gas can to deliver it to Brandon. Ladisha placed a gas can on the front porch before taking a shower and turning in for the night. She also placed her phone inside her van to charge because the battery was running low and she didn't have an indoor charger. Kyle's paycheck had not yet cleared, so his plan was to pick up the gas can from Ladisha's porch, drive out to where Brandon was stranded, and get money for him and fill the can. When he and Audrey arrived at Brandon's truck, Brandon was nowhere to be found. Around the same time Kyle and Audrey arrived at Brandon's truck, A Deputy Neal from the Cook County Sheriff's Office arrived at the scene. He was responding to a 911 call from a passing motorist about an abandoned truck that was slightly blocking the road. None of the parties observed any damage to Brandon's vehicle. However, the truck appeared to have been hastily or sloppily ditched, with the back end protruding out into the road. The truck's doors were unlocked and the keys were gone, as well as Brandon's cell phone and wallet. At the time Kyle, Audrey, and Deputy Neal arrived at the scene, none of them were aware of Brandon's 911 call 15 minutes earlier. The 911 operator had not obtained Brandon's name or location, and the call was dismissed once it was dropped from the signal and the line went dead. 3 days after Brandon's disappearance, Ladisha was scrolling through her phone records and saw the outgoing call to 911 on the night he disappeared, bringing attention to this critical piece of evidence. Back at the scene, Deputy Neal informed Kyle about a passing motorist's call to 911 regarding the truck that was sitting in the road. No one knew about Brandon's recent 911 call. Kyle informed Deputy Neal that Brandon should be returning to his vehicle soon. Deputy Neal turned on the truck's hazard lights and locked the doors. He said that a tow truck was going to come at 8 o'clock in the morning, and if the truck was still there, it was going to be towed. He left the scene at 1:18, as did Kyle and Audrey. As they were driving down the road, Audrey texted Brandon at 1:19 to tell him that his truck was going to be towed if he didn't get back to it and move it by 8. Brandon was able to call through to Audrey and tell her that he was bleeding, but the call dropped before she could get any further information. Kyle and Audrey then began driving up and down the road searching for Brandon and calling his name. Kyle rang Ladisha's phone multiple times, but he was never answered because the truck was still in the van. Kyle also tried calling Brandon's phone. Around 3 a.m., Brandon's phone stopped ringing, and either due to a losing battery or because it was shut off. Around 4:30 a.m., Ladisha retrieved her phone from her van and saw the missed calls from Kyle and Brandon. As she attempted to call Brandon, but the call went straight to voicemail. She then called Kyle, who updated her about finding Brandon's truck, but no sign of the man. Kyle decided to head home and search again once the sun came up. He left the gas can in the back of Brandon's truck and headed home. Ladisha then called the sheriff's office to see if they had found Brandon, but they had not. By 7 a.m., Kyle's paycheck had cleared, so he returned to Brandon's truck and filled the gas can. Becoming increasingly alarmed, Kyle then informed her about the earlier phone conversation in which Brandon had said he was bleeding. Ladisha subsequently hired a private search plane to comb the area for any sign of him. She also set up the Help Find Brandon Lawson Facebook page. Ladisha, Kyle, and other loved ones organized several ground search parties for Brandon. Just over a week after his disappearance, August 16, 2013, law enforcement conducted an aerial search using infrared cameras. They found nothing of relevance. August 29, 2013, the investigators combed 2,500 acres around the site where Brandon's truck was located. October 24, 2013, a final search was conducted using human cadaver dogs. The dogs found no sign of Brandon, or any bodies for that matter. A total of 7 searches were conducted by law enforcement. Brandon's family was denied access to some privately owned land in order to conduct their own searches, but law enforcement searched everywhere and they were never able to find the missing man. The 911 calls Brandon had made didn't help in the search. His connection was spotty, and a lot of important information was never received. The conversation went something like 911 emergency, followed by, yes, I'm in the middle of a field, which was unintelligible after that. Just pulled some guy over, unintelligible again. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here. The guy's chasing him into the woods. Please hurry. The operator said, okay, could you run that one by me again? There was such a lack of information, and there were so many unintelligible sections of it, they couldn't understand what he was saying. Brandon then sounded as if he were talking to someone else, and the operator was hearing some of the conversation. It sounded as if Brandon said someone had been shot. The operator asked if an ambulance was needed, and Brandon said yes, and then no, that he needed the police instead. This was followed by some background noise before the line went dead. People listening to the tape recording have all come up with varying and different interpretations of the conversation. Some think a state trooper was involved in a shooting and then tried to stop Brandon from talking to the 911 operator. There have been instances where criminals have dressed up to look like law enforcement to pull people over and rob them. On a few occasions, people wound up missing or murdered. The folks who think the law enforcement were involved also say the tape recording was messed with so no one could understand most of the recording. The folks who say law enforcement were involved in the shooting someone and killing Brandon have zero evidence to support their theory. Some just don't trust or like the police. There are folks who say that Brandon was run off the road by either a motorcycle gang or 2 vehicles traveling side by side, and he had pulled off quickly, and that's why his pickup was sitting at an angle to the shoulder. The trouble is, there's nothing to show this might have happened. The truck might have simply stopped running due to being out of gas. A few people came up with the theory that Brandon was having mental issues and he simply imagined the whole shooting and needing the police. He then wandered off on foot. The only thing we know for sure is Brandon was driving on 277 near Bront when he ran out of gas. He left his pickup and disappeared. No body has ever been found. His bank account nor his cell phone have shown any activity since his disappearance. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, let other folks know that they should listen as well. If you'd like to contact me, send an email to strangethings@arkanasa.com. Till next Saturday, this is Chris James.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder 3. Strange things that happen here, no stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.